Good morning from beautiful Leon, Nicaragua. I'm Scott Al Miller, and this is my life here in Central America. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the emotional reactions in two diverging directions that create some real problems for people when they're thinking about border runs and residency here in Nicaragua. And I'm sure that these same things carry on to many other countries because there tends to be two major factors. One is emotional, based on the sounds of words or human desires to avoid volatility, and the other is based on misinformation or incorrect sources of information because they are sourced for different locations, and we don't realize that these things are not universal because they seem like they must be because the words are often overlapping. What do I mean? We're going to talk about that right after the bump. This particular conversation, in exactly the same way, comes up an awful lot of times, and finding good ways to phrase it to make people really understand how they're misinterpreting these concepts is super important. I've had multiple conversations in the last 72 hours where people were either slightly misled and still going to do the right thing, but you could see the underlying mentality, and in others where people had absolutely made incorrect decisions about everything they were looking to do, for a lot of reasons, but one, because of this emotional reaction. So we have a video about why emotions are dangerous. Now, that video talks about it in the context of a business, but your life is like a business. You still want success. For example, if you move to a new country, you want to be allowed to stay. That would be considered success. If you move to a new country, you want to have a financial freedom to actually be able to survive and not, become destitute or whatever. That is also a business decision. There are some things when moving to a new country or anything in life that are super subjective. Oh, I really like the weather here, but I could put up with weather that's not perfect. I really like the food here, but I could put up with food that's not perfect, and so forth. There are things that come down to just you, but some things like successfully being able to stay and successfully being able to afford your life, these are objective goals and things that we simply need. And so when we're looking at those factors, we should be using business processes. You may want to use business processes for other parts of your life, but other parts, when they're subjective, do have an emotional element of value. But when we're talking about your income or your ability to actually have your paperwork work and that you're allowed to stay in a country, these do not have value to you even suggesting that emotions may have a valid component. They do not. They work against you, they are terrible, and your brain hopefully would logically say, I'm scared of my own emotional reaction to these things because emotions are dangerous. All I care about is the result, not how I feel about that result. How we feel about going to dinner at a restaurant. Oh, I picked this restaurant. It had, empirically worse food, but I feel great about having gone there for whatever reason. That emotional feeling at the end of the day is the greatest value. So arguing that your emotions are important there, very obvious. But if it comes down to, I don't feel good about having gotten residency, but I'm able to stay, versus I feel great, however, I didn't get to stay. Empirical failure. That's not a success, right? So we need to use business thought processes, or basically logic rather than emotions when dealing with these things. So what are we talking about? With almost all people, we get the same reaction. The first is when we mention border runs, which, let's be clear, is the official, legal, required process for a great many things here in Nicaragua. When we mention border runs, a huge percentage of people, whether they articulate it to me or not, in their minds see this as a negative. They use mental phrases, and they may say this out loud, like getting away with something. This is not a loophole. You are not tricking the government. You are not doing something you're not supposed to do. This is what you are supposed to do. You are not doing something that has some high risk to it. There is nothing like that in the border run system. This is the official process up to a certain point for starting and possibly continuing to stay in Nicaragua. It is official, right? Just like coming into the country the first time. It is not some sneaking in to be a tourist in Nicaragua. That is not the case. They know you're coming in. You present them a passport. That's official. Now, if you actually sneak over the border and don't show anyone your passport and just, come across the boat in the middle of the night, that's sneaking in. That is not a border run. That's human trafficking. The, but we're talking about border runs where you go through the border control, you show them your passport, you get a stamp and so forth. You follow the law and do everything you're supposed to do. You are not getting away with anything. That is not the way to look at it. It's also not a hard process. It's also not an expensive process. So there's a ton of things that people tend to assume are big negatives with it. And there are some negatives to any process, right? Just the act of going through any process has some negatives. It takes effort, takes some money, uses your time. You have to remember to do it and so forth. But outside of those basic things, doing a border run is insanely simple for the majority of people in Nicaragua. There's always someone who has a reason why it's hard for them. But in general, this is very, very, very simple, straightforward, reliable. Conversely, when we're looking at residency, people have a tendency to emotionally perceive residency as far better than it actually is. So they see border runs as negative without knowing why. Ask someone who says they want to avoid border runs and consistently. Now, not everyone wants to avoid them. Some people just see them as a negative and they just have that kind of emotional place. Oh, it doesn't seem great to do border runs forever. Almost always, these are people who haven't done one, right? It's always someone who hasn't tested it. They're just assuming. When you then talk about, so they have this built-in negative, right? And often, so if they say, I'm not willing to do a border run, and I have this constantly, and I say, tell me why you're unwilling to do a border run, they then articulate false information, right? It might as well be, well, when you do a border run, they shoot you and you die. So I'm not willing to do that. But clearly they don't do that. That's a made up thing. So all the things that people ever list for me, now I have once in a while talked to people who are like, I choose to live in the far north of the country. It's super far to a border. I don't have a car. And it's like 8 hours through mountain roads to get to the border. I have met those people. And that's a valid reason, right? It's not a black and white, I can't do it, but this is actually a lot of work compared to most of us, nearly all expats, like 98% at least for expats. It is not hard to get to the border and back. Very easy, generally pretty cheap. But there are a few people for whom it is hard. There are some legitimate things. But outside of those, very specifically, non-ambulatory, super far from the border people, which is very, very few, no one has ever articulated a reason that they don't like the border run except for things they made up, which is the same as logically admitting that you do know that the border run is good and your brain is demonstrating that it's trying to reverse rationalize why it told you to emotionally want to avoid something that logically makes sense. So that is a way of your brain expressing to other people that it has made a reckless, dangerous decision and that the person speaking to you is not functioning rationally. All right, so that is what you get. This is a psychological thing to look for. When people do that, that is reverse rationalization. They didn't have a reason for not wanting to go to a border, and now instead of admitting, oh, I just felt like it was the wrong thing, is that not right? They're not questioning themselves. They're not looking for official information. They're not looking for firsthand guidance. They're now trying to double down on justifying an incorrect emotional response, reverse rationalization. All human brains do this. It is something to look for in yourself. It's something to look for in others. But that's what we're seeing happening with this almost every time, right? Well, I'm sure that the process is unreliable. Why are you sure that it's unreliable when everyone who does it is sure it's reliable, right? Does that not smack as being disingenuous in your own brain's logic? Of course it does. But your brain doesn't want to admit that it's irrational. So it tries to make you feel that you're being rational. And it's your job to step back, take a deep breath and go, wait, my brain is emotional. That's how humans are. I'm human. Therefore, my brain will make irrational decisions. And then it will try to convince me that it did have rationale at the time. And I don't want to admit that I made an irrational decision. So I'm going to give in and repeat that irrational stuff. But to other people, it doesn't sound rational. It sounds like I'm a raving lunatic. I should not say that. I should think and say, I probably made a bad decision. I should write down any rationale I have and see if it's true, verify if those things are fact, and I should ask people who actually know and accept that information rather than going based on something I made up and trying to pretend that that is true. The number of people who actually argue with me that the border runs I've done aren't real and that they know more about a border run they've never done than everyone I know who does them every day, not every day, but are living on that system all the time, is absolutely crazy. But people really do that all the time. Now, with residency paperwork, we get the exact same emotional reaction, except in the opposite. Instead of being emotionally averse to doing something that they should want to do most of the time, they become very, very addicted to the idea of getting residency. So much so that people actually think that it's good to start looking into it and trying to get it before they've come to Nicaragua. In many cases, even before they've visited the first time, which is completely nonsensical. And Nicaragua is not going to let you do that. It's so crazy Nicaragua is going to protect you from yourself, but it doesn't stop people from getting here and immediately trying to start the process and being addicted to it and racing to it and saying things like, I'm not willing to do a border run. I've got to get my residency right away. But again, ask them why, and they will universally. And this one I mean universally, except for those people who have already stated that the border run's a problem because of their distance or not being ambulatory. And for them, often there is a waiver. I can't guarantee one, obviously, but that is a possibility. Look into that before you give up on the system. But for people who are reasonably in that decision process, they will say every single time false facts about residency as to why they want residency. Nobody ever wants residency for an actual hard, concrete reason that truly exists. Everyone always wants it because they emotionally have desired it, and then their brain reverse rationalizes that in order to have it make sense that they wanted residency, something must be true, and so it starts throwing things at the wall to try to see if people will believe whatever it is you say, right? So reverse rationalization sounds like raving lunacy to other people, and it is a very American cultural trait that we are not supposed to question other people saying obvious lies, but that does everyone a disservice. It teaches people to reverse rationalize, it enforces people making really dangerous decisions, and it just accepts dishonesty as an acceptable process, which encourages worse and worse decisions in everyone. Everyone loses when we don't call out reverse rationalization and incorrect logic statements, right? Everyone loses. It does not help anybody. Not you, not them, nobody. So best not to do it. Every culture has its own traits that make it dangerous and less than stellar. This is an American one, which I'm very familiar with because I grew up in America. So because of that, people will say, well, it guarantees that I never have to leave the country. Completely false. There is no additional guarantee in the residency system, none over the border run system. You have no additional protections that you won't have to leave the country. None. So anybody who suggests anything of the sort, complete fabrication. There's no guarantees. If the government wants to remove you as a tourist at the time you do a border run, while you're a resident, at the time that you do a residency refresh, doesn't matter, you will leave, right? They can make that decision anytime. It is their discretion. You have no guarantees against that. You can have no guarantees against that. Now, is it something to really worry about? Also not a thing to worry about, right? So one, it is a false protection, but a false protection against a non-concern. So it's layers of, first you had to convince yourself this is something to be scared of. Now that you've created a false fear, you're looking for a false protection. So this is how your brain works, and it's how people consistently try to justify residency. The second thing is that they will say, well, I don't want to do something every 6 months, so I don't have to do that with residency. That is also false. You have to do something. It's not a border run, and arguably it is less work than a border run every 6 months. But you do have to get what's called a cedula reprint. Many people call this a renewal. It is not a renewing of anything, except for maybe a piece of paper. But what you're doing is going to an office. In some cases, you may be lucky and be able to go to a local office. We've heard people say that they can do this and get their cedula printed locally. So in that case, it is a very minor deal, typically 15 minutes and very small travel time, depends on where you live. For many people, we hear they have to go to Managua to do this, and traditionally, at least at the beginning, that's where people were all going. That is often quite a bit of travel for people, and anything in Managua, including just getting a cedula reprinted, could be an 8-hour day of absolute torture in a place with no air conditioning, and often the lines take all day, and you never know if you're going to make it through. It's incredibly stressful. So if you have to reprint in Managua, I would make the argument that the border run is so much easier and more reliable, because you know when you go over the border, you're going to be able to come back the same day. But when you go to Managua to get your cedula reprinted, you don't have that assurance that you're going to get through the line, or that the line's going to accept you, or that you're going to be put in the correct line. All those things go wrong on a regular basis. You may have to spend days in Managua trying to get that reprint, whereas the border control is consistently over the border and back. So that theory that there's something easier, that there's more protection, absolutely backwards. Emotions are your enemy, right? You have to work from actual information, not work from these imaginary things and just assume that things that aren't even remotely based on anything in reality in Nicaragua are true. Then, for normal residency holders, you have to renew your residency every year. Yes, with a border run, you go through a full renewal every 6 months. With a residency, you go through a full renewal every year with this paperwork process every 6 months. So you're not getting out of anything every 6 months. Importantly, though, if you are doing the border run system, you only have to do border runs if you don't travel, which for some people they don't. So it's exactly the same. But this is worst case scenario. In any other non-worst case scenario, if you're doing the border runs, all it takes is any amount of travel. I went to Mexico for the weekend. I spent a few months in Panama. If you're like me, I went to work in Bolivia. Any of those things acts as a border run without doing a border run. So for me, many years living here, I only ever had to do one border run. Now, that was kind of extreme, but I have other friends who've been here for almost as long. They've never done a border run because their lifestyle simply resets their visa so often that it never comes up at all. Yet they live here full time, have houses, have cars, and so forth. So that's the idea that the border run is more work. It is rarely, under extreme circumstances, the same work. Under almost all circumstances, it is a little less to dramatically less work overall, and potentially more reliable. The residency process does take a bit of time. It does take a bit of effort. It does, in theory, let you do things like own a car and register it in your own name, but we know people who have done that without that. So that's a soft benefit. It may be easier and more straightforward, but it can be done otherwise. And there's consistent workarounds like forming a company to do it, but there's also the direct purchase can happen. I don't know how you go about doing that. I don't know how likely it is to work, but I do know it has worked recently during the time that we were saying you couldn't do that. And sometimes it just works. So it's not super reliable, but it is there. And if you know it's there, pursuing it will make it more likely to happen than if you don't. Now, why do we end up with these emotional reactions? Partially, it's just because of the name. Border run sounds like you're doing something weird. It's not something that people just understand. When we say residency, it sounds like some official process. It sounds like something guaranteed. And here in Nicaragua, both things are essentially guaranteed. People are not randomly kicked out of the country, unlike the United States, where people who are permanent top-level residency holders, those are called green card holders, are now being advised not to travel because their residency is being revoked broadly. People are constantly not being allowed back in the United States, even when they have had residency for decades and permanent residency and are on a path to what should be guaranteed citizenship. They are still being banned from the United States. They're losing their residency status, even though it's permanent and should be what people consider safe and whatever, demonstrating that the concept of residency, anyone who's American should instantly be super wary of residency because they observe themselves that the residency from the country that they are from does not give you any assurances. In fact, it gives you less. If you have a tourist visa to go into the country that has been recently issued, that is more likely to let you in than a long-term permanent residency card is that is supposed to guarantee your entrance. So very important that in the real world, people are taking known facts about places and reversing them, even from the U.S.'s perspective, and then reversing them for Nicaragua, where it's also the same reverse. Now, what is really happening, I think, in many cases is there are a few places that people want to move to in broad numbers, and when they're doing research, they end up doing research generically about countries like Mexico, where people do residency all the time. Mexico has one of the most unique residency systems out there anywhere, and because of that, a lot of people do their research and get this really unique and not applicable to much of anywhere else in the world style residency research. They're still getting misinformation about it. Some of the things that they say are just absolutely wrong everywhere in the world. But many of the thought processes, the emotions, the things that say, well, I want to research early, I want to do it before I get there, not an option here. I want to avoid doing any border runs. Sorry, a border run is part of your residency process. It's all official. It's just how it is. If you are unwilling to do it, simply don't come to Nicaragua. This is not the country for you. You're basically saying, I refuse to do what the government wants me to do for my residency. Well, then you're not going to get residency and you're not going to have a border run. What is your game plan? Don't come here, right? If that's your mentality from day one, you're picking the wrong country. You've decided that you want a country that works in a specific way. You need to find a country that works that way and go there if that's, and I've had people recently that were that emotionally tied to the manner in which they wanted their border runs and residencies to be viewed by the government, that they were unwilling to consider moving to any country where the government had different policies. That's, I'm going to say, quite literally insane, but it's important to recognize that and say, I don't know how this goal plays into your life, but it doesn't do the thing that they want. In an example this week, I had someone who had a specific fear about the border runs, and they were able to articulate this as a very specific fear, but it was, again, very bad research and very bad logic. They said, well, I heard that some other country had this requirement based on tourists in the past, and it was all very like, yeah, it was a real thing. Years ago, somewhere else, and they really did have that requirement. So I want to avoid that. But the thing that they wanted to avoid here in Nicaragua doesn't exist when you're doing the border runs, but does actually exist when you're doing residency. So they were, again, making the decision based on a factor they could articulate and doing the exact polar opposite thing of what they stated they wanted to do. They were creating the problem they stated they were trying to avoid. Why? Because they were using emotions, not facts and logic. They weren't thinking through anything that they were using as information. They also had all false sources, every place they went for information, and had loads of misinformation beyond just the Nicaragua stuff. Like, they had all kinds of just general misinformation. So they had so many layers of being led astray that it was very difficult to carry on a conversation to really dig into what their needs were, because everything in their worldview was bizarre, and so you didn't have any facts to work from in any particular angle. But it shows how much allowing emotions to lead us astray, avoiding facts, avoiding logic, will allow our brains to completely dismantle our world to a point, lead us into a great deal of danger, cost us quite a bit of money, and very likely put us into the exact situation that we claimed we were attempting to avoid. That's the amazing thing, is just how often the very stated goal that is given is the thing undermined by the requirements created through the emotional reaction. And in this example case that I've been working with, that's exactly where they wanted. Every single thing that they stated as their reason for wanting to do one thing was put as a likely risk because of them doing that. Everything, not one item that they were concerned about made sense for the direction that they were then choosing to go. All right, guys, thanks for joining me. I hope this was educational and beneficial and helps you reevaluate how you're looking at things. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ScottAlMiller. Get down those show notes, check out all the stuff we have for you. Help support Marcela in her cancer journey. She's about 2/3 of the way through her chemotherapy process at this point. We are still waiting for the final reading of the results to know how that process is going. Hopefully we know that pretty soon, possibly later this week, but we say that a lot, and they keep delaying the reading of the results. They truly haven't read them, so they're not stalling because of the answer or anything. As always, if you would hit that like button and please subscribe, consider hitting that join button. All kinds of things that you can do to help support the channel, including watching another episode, telling someone about the show, getting someone else hooked on it, let them know about all the relocation and moving abroad and tourism and Latin America and Nicaragua and all kinds of content that we have here. Let someone know. Of course, if you post this on social media like LinkedIn or X or Facebook, all of that does a lot to get the word out there about the show. So we really appreciate the people out there promoting us and making all of this possible. And of course, join us on Thursday nights for our live stream when you can have a real-time feedback with me and other community members. And check out our social media down in the notes. Boy, it's a lot of stuff. Thanks for joining me. I will see all of you tomorrow.